Good afternoon, everyone. Afternoon in the UK, anyway. And it's morning where Adam is, very early in the morning. My name is Anna Roderick, and I am Editorial Director of Multilingual Matters. And it was my enormous pleasure to work really closely with Adam Schwartz on the writing process for his book, Spanish So White: Conversations on the Inconvenient Racism of a Foreign Language Education. Adam is Associate Professor of Language, Culture and Society at Oregon State University in the US. And Adam is going to, the kind of reason for having this discussion now, the book came out in January this year. We are in the process of publishing an audiobook of Adam's book, which is the first audiobook we've ever done. We were hoping by this point that the audiobook would be available everywhere. And it is currently available everywhere apart from Audible, who are working on it apparently, and it should be there next week, I'm informed. So look out for that. So Adam, thank you for joining me. I wondered first to start whether you could tell us a little bit about the impetus for writing the book, why you felt it was necessary.
Sure. Well, first, I want to thank you so much, Anna, and then, of course, Flo and Eleanor, and everyone on the editorial team at Multilingual Matters. It's really great to be here and start the day this way. This is a real privilege. So thank you. And hi, everyone, wherever you are, joining us today. The impetus behind this book. So I think it's twofold. On one hand, there are the issues and lived experiences that I claim, going way back in my life, that involved thinking about the ways in which language in my life was never detached from race, racial difference, ethnicity, perception, my own perception of those differences, which always meant grappling with whiteness, even long before I had the vocabulary to do so, or long before I was in the company of other folks who were willing to do so with me. It was there. Having the great privilege of going to school, university, engaging in postgraduate work, meant being invited into conversations where there was that vocabulary, there was theory, there was framework, but more importantly, there were the wisdoms of folks in those spaces and not in those spaces in my life who had been engaged in this work for a very long time. And said, you know what? Yeah, actually, language makes race happen. And race, as Ta-Nehisi Coates would say, a child of racism, operates linguistically. And around we go. And my question has for a long time been, well, what is the responsibility of language educators in all of this? So we're teaching language, but are we teaching about language and who we are through language? And so the second part of that answer is that for some time, I have been invited into conversations with my students about this stuff. And this never starts necessarily. I mean, sometimes it does. Maybe more recently it does, with a conversation that's explicit and overt, wherein a student asks, hey, I really want to talk about these intersections between language and race. Instead, it's a question like, why is it that all my Spanish teachers have been white folks who don't speak Spanish natively? Or maybe it's not a question, but it is a statement, direct or indirect, about how, despite someone having spoken Spanish or being tied very closely to the Spanish language for their entire life, feels that their Spanish isn't good enough, and yields to me as the professor or teacher to teach them how to do it better. And I have to step back and ask myself, well, why me? Why am I here? Why am I needed? And how do we all make sense of this? So constantly in being invited into conversations and in being invited to contend with myself, my role, my responsibility, but more importantly, how this is never just about me, that I'm in community with a lot of folks that either are or should be engaging in these questions. And how and where do we begin? I think I have been grappling that for a long time, with that for a long time, and also using that to ask a larger question that I've been grappling with for a long time, which is what can count and what should count as a more just and a more equitable Spanish language education. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's really interesting. And you mentioned graduate school there. Were any particular kind of thinkers, either during the course of your own education or later, whose ideas, whose books have had a real influence on this book?
Yes. The first two folks that immediately come to mind are my late advisor, Richard Ruiz, and Jane Hill. Mm-hmm. To whom the book is dedicated, both of them, as well as my students. But those two individuals who I had the privilege of having on my doctoral committee and shepherding me all the way through all 5 years of my doctoral work, both anthropologists, one educational and applied and the other linguistic, although Jane certainly worked across all fields within anthropology very actively. But these two folks in particular, as well as folks like Lidia Otero from Mexican American Studies, Norma Mendoza Denton. These were all folks that were on campus at the university. And then, of course, there were the folks that I met outside of the university that have, still been in my life, that, again, as I say, have been engaged in theorizing race and thinking about race as it pertains to language for a very long time. Yeah. I should also say, while I was at university, as a doctoral student, I was also teaching. So I want to talk about too and name I think about one particular co-teacher that I was involved with as a middle school teacher, who was not an academic in the sense that we're defining academia, but was pulling from tremendous lived experience in order to negotiate her new role as being asked to teach Spanish along with me as Spanish to middle schoolers, and so engaging in these sort of peripheral conversations throughout this experiment that we were sharing, despite different lived experiences, different ages, different identities, incredibly beneficial, incredibly patient on her part, an incredible gift that I'm still processing. So
yeah. And you mentioned conversations there in that last sentence, and I suppose that's something I wanted to pick up as well, talking about the kind of theoretical background to the book. That I can remember when we were working on this, we talked about the place of the conversation, and the conversation in the title, and then the conversation throughout the book. And one of the things I really like about the book is the way that these other voices crop up. And so you're not just encouraging your readers to have conversations with themselves and with other people, but you're also modeling how conversation has shaped your thinking and your work and stuff. And I really like, the voices of your students that pop up occasionally in the text and that kind of thing. So I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about how important conversation was in terms of both the style of the book and of the sort of theoretical thinking behind it.
Yeah, thanks. That's a good question. I want to say that it's sort of conversation on one hand seems like an obvious framework. Surely it must be because it's always been there. I've been invited into these conversations, or I've been um, necessarily excluded from other conversations, as have we all potentially when it comes to these particular issues and topics. At the same time, I don't think I really appreciated conversation as a type of methodology um, until fairly recently, certainly not until I arrived at Oregon State, where I currently am, and engaged uh, in work with colleagues outside of language education and outside of of the professoriate in liberal arts, for instance. But I was working with colleagues in student affairs and engaging in conversation groups with those folks, and also inviting students into collectives and conversations about white identity and about racial identity. And these were folks that uh, were much more well versed in facilitation, in drawing their work from, for instance, disciplines or paradigms with activist histories, uh, and uh, and those folks know, for instance, ethnic studies, indigenous studies, women, gender, and sexuality studies. These are disciplines that had to fight and continue to have to fight for their existence in the academy. So this is not mathematics. So it's nothing against math, but they're different origin stories, and these are disciplines that uh, necessarily aim to elevate the wisdoms inherent in other methodologies and other ways of seeing the world and reading the world. We're in storytelling, for instance. We're in conversation. We're in dialogue. Is a type of wisdom and a methodology that must be valued. Its urgency in valuing and being valued is essential, and especially when it requires listening to marginalized voices. And so I realized, oh, I had been invited to consider this methodology all along, and I never considered it a methodology per se, regardless of the fact that I was engaging in ethnographic research for some time. I was engaging with focused interviews, focused conversations. I learned about, kind of the in some ways bits and pieces of this methodology, but it wasn't until relatively recently that it really clicked for me. And so I really wanted to, in some ways, show my appreciation for what I had learned by virtue of my colleagues, which I acknowledge, and then also the students who were along with us for that ride. And in some ways demonstrate how I had been adopting that approach in my own classroom spaces over the past 10 years. More specifically, maybe less than that. And so I should say that again, as you said, you hear the voices of my students show up here, but I hope you hear and see and feel the methodology, the classroom work that's been done, that engages in that type of conversational approach.
Yeah, no, very much so. Yeah. So let's move on to the writing process. And were there any kind of particular challenges? Anything unexpected that occurred? I asked this question knowing full well what the answer is.
Yeah, I mean, this was yes, you mentioned, I realize this is the question that invites you to air your anxiety dreams in public, which I really appreciated. Yes, that's this was a project that I had in my back pocket for some time. It was never fully fleshed out. I guess it never really is until you're in it.
Mhm.
Um, and uh, you know, it long story very short, it is a product of lockdown, the pandemic. It is a document of sorts that was rolling out at the same time in which I was back home in Los Angeles. At first, obviously voluntarily, I was on sabbatical, and I was being hosted by dear friends and colleagues at UCLA, and at the same time also meeting my wife and partner simultaneously, and then and in many ways engaging in a new life, both personally and as a thinker. Um, Stepping away from my campus here in Oregon, and then all of a sudden, March 2020, here's another paradigm shift. Here's another shift in consciousness. There's another shift in in everyone's well-being, and um, and so I remained in Los Angeles, and on a much brighter note, was invited into a new way of doing a relationship that has been incredible, and living with my partner at that time, but all the while trying to process what was going on around us, both in terms of the pandemic, and surviving that day to day, both as a couple, but also in terms of loved ones, friends, workplace, so on and so forth. My workplace was in front of a computer in a small apartment, but whereas my partner's was as a nurse at the hospital, so a bit of a different context there. But then also at the same time, we were moving into the summer of 2020. There was intense reckoning, as we all recall, with some of the, if not all of the issues that are brought up in this particular book. Um, and and so on and so forth. And so I think about how this is a book, as I suppose any piece of writing is. It is a product of place, time, and context. So if I were to do anything differently, if I were to write it now, well, my life is very different now, even though it's been just a few short years. We also live in a new political moment now. That once is this, for lack of a much better term, sort of post lockdown. I really hesitate to say post pandemic because we'll be constantly living with it. But now our eyes and our attention shifts to what's happening right now in Gaza, and the ways in which, indeed, in order to interpret the absolute horrors that are happening in this part of the world, we also contend with the messaging. We contend with language. We contend with ourselves as folks that are interpreting language, discourse, messaging. And I have to continuously ask myself, as a language teacher, what is my responsibility? So this is much bigger than just about teaching Spanish. When the students are in a classroom, and for example, this term, we are we're embarking on exploration of phonetics and pronunciation, and I think to myself, what an absolute privilege it is to be in this space with these incredible students, and we are exploring syllables, we're exploring vowels, we're exploring utterances, we are naming the variation of something that is innately human, which is voice. And we have the ability to do this and laugh and smile and be vulnerable with one another while doing this, while exploring voice and exploring language, the essence of our humanness and humanity. And in the sense, reminding ourselves of what this means and what this feels like, while trying to contend something that is with something with violence that is an absolute crime on humanity. It's it is dehumanizing in its origin. And so I think about how these as an educator and as a facilitator, being invited into spaces with my students, being invited into conversations with them about life, what it is that we do, what it is that we think about, what does it mean to learn a language. I'm never not brought back through the pages of this book. We are never not political beings. We're never not social beings. We're never not racialized beings. And so I would have to contend with that as I would write this book. I would have to.
Yeah.
I'm talking about it now as I'm talking about the book, and so we're never divorced from that context.
Yeah. Yeah. And I suppose following up on that, I mean, you've talked about how the book is situated within a particular moment, both in terms of the world and in terms of your own life. And if you were writing a very different kind of book, a very dry piece of quantitative research on phonetics or something, you would be absent from the pages of that book. And I was just wondering how, I think we talked about this a lot in the writing process, the vulnerability of putting yourself in the book to the extent that you do. I mean, one of my favorite things in the book is the photo of you as a, I don't know, 7 or 8 year old in your Michael Jackson t-shirt. Like, we don't have that in many of our books.
Yeah,
so I was just wondering how both how you kind of work through that as a kind of, this is something I'm doing and these are the boundaries I'm going to establish in terms of what I put in the book, what I don't put in the book, in terms of your own life, but also then, were there any particular examples of that kind of writing that you looked to as examples of how to do this well and how to write about your experience without kind of privileging your own experience?
Right. Yes, exactly. Because I think at some point it's sort of like, well, this cannot be this sort of autobiography. This look, world, this is all about me. I, and on one hand, I sometimes I'm very surprised with myself that I engage in a lot of this. But I also wanted to contend with what I bring into this project. So who am I in my whiteness? How did that happen? How does it continue to happen? How did my family learn to become white people? How do we continue to reproduce that in order to survive in this system? To believe that we are white continuously in order to survive in this system. To answer these questions, I have to go back. I have to go back to my own socialization into education. the choices my parents made, and the ways in which they really reflect on these choices years later, the choices that their parents made, the languages that we lost, the ways in which we can't remember culture. All of us, and this is what I ask my students to contend with as well, all of us can relate to this on some level. In order to survive in the violence that is our daily society, it's colonial condition, we have to forget. Those are that's not it's not an original idea. I mean, those are the ideas of folks that have been that live those reminders on a daily basis. Writers, thinkers, former teachers, poets. I mean, we can go off and name an endless list of folks that with whom we engage in their wisdom every day. And I think about maybe some of the earliest times in which someone very patiently asked me, again, the question, so who are you really? Why are you here? Why do we need you? Have you done the work? And then knowing the wisdom behind those questions, then finally having the courage to ask myself those questions. And then also ask my students those questions. And so when you mention that picture, on one hand, it's a cute photo. I mean, yeah, I remember that T-shirt. It's a pretty amazing relic, right? But that's me necessarily standing next to someone who we named as a housekeeper. That was a type of Spanish language education in my early youth that I benefited from by virtue of my family's ability to ascend in class and acquire capital and be able to hire a domestic laborer who spoke Spanish.
Yeah, yeah.
And that is education. That is education on so many different levels. And I went to school later on with many children who claimed that experience. I also went to school with children whose parents were those people. This is a Spanish language education. And so I think about the ways in which, in order to write this book, but also in order to show up every day as an educator, as a language teacher, I have to think about what I am bringing into that space. And again, and I have to think about power. And so I think in order to do that, we have to go back constantly. And I hope that other folks have the ability or the patience with themselves to begin to do that, because this is not something that we're supposed to do. I think that we're not supposed to critically examine, like, how does race get made? How have I become a racialized being? How has this stuff been normalized in my life, such that I don't give a second thought about it, because I get to benefit from being a white person in society. So yeah, I mean, this is one of the first pieces that I ever published in graduate school was on the discourse of household Spanish. Long story short, it's a discourse analysis of handbooks that have been on the market for a very long time that instruct white employers to speak to household help, maids, gardeners, if you will, using very limited Spanish. I look at the ways in which these type of requests, if you will, at best, or directives, commands, are are offered in instructional messaging to the consumer of these books. What I didn't say was why I was interested in this at the time. I didn't say because I'm familiar with this culture. I didn't say I picked up one of these books off the shelf growing up at home. This was a textbook that I knew before I sat in a classroom. Whether or not my parents used it, I don't think they did. I think that's irrelevant, though. I think the fact that it was there and I thumbed through it and I was kind of curious about this, and it stuck with me.
Yeah.
So I think that that's the idea here is that look at the realia, look at the photos, look at the documents, look at the stuff that you have access to that tells you where you're from. And look at the stuff as data for yourself. And those are questions that come from autoethnography, which is also something that I was invited in to consider relatively recently, and that figures into the methodology of this book as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, necessarily because of what you're writing about, the book is really situated in a very particular context, which is the context of Spanish in the US.
Right.
But what do you think readers reading in very different contexts might be able to take away from the ideas in the book?
Yeah, this is a good question. I think, a few things. One is I hope that it gives anyone pause who might come to this book, that it engages us to contend with the responsibilities we all have as social beings, in these larger matrices of domination and oppression in which we navigate daily. At the very least, that when you show up in a classroom, you show up with all those identities. Some of them you'll hold dear and you'll hold close to the chest and no one maybe knows about them. And others are visible and perceived and perhaps inaccurate. But then there you are in that space. And I want other educators to really think about this as well. I think it's really a great hope for a more transformative language education, is to really start from where we're at and where we're at in community with one another.
Yeah.
So, therefore, engaging in that community, always in our language, always through our language, that's all politically situated as well. That practice is political. That the ways in which all of that is normalized is a product of a larger system that was designed very intentionally. Who designed it? Who is missing from those design plans? What are the expectations, for instance, of language learning in your community, in your town, in your nation state? And who benefits from those expectations and who is designed to not benefit from them? So the political is always personal. We're personal individuals acting within these political systems. And the other thing too is I hope you revisit, as we were talking about a moment ago, your own narratives, your own trajectories as you survived, and reflect on the survival throughout the years that are your life, in and out of school, in and out of learning opportunities, in and out of your education. And I also, a lot of this too was, for me, was really thinking deeply about my teachers. I reconnected with a few along the way. I struggled with what I remembered with a few as well. That was tricky. with stuff that was really problematic, and then I really thought about it, and I realized, oh my gosh, like I've been reproducing this, or things like that. But then I hope that we hold grace for our teachers as well, who themselves are the products of the same system that we're all trying to make sense of. So I hope there's some of that as well.
Yeah, yeah, brilliant. Okay, so we'll move on just to talk about your audiobook. Just before I do that, just to remind everyone watching that if you put your questions in the question and answer chat, then my colleagues will feed them to me. We should have some time for questions towards the end. So at some point, really reasonably close to handing the book over for production, I think you kind of went, oh, have you ever thought about doing an audiobook? Oh, here we go. And
Curveball. Yeah.
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 It's one of those lockdown projects.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you could kind of talk about why you wanted to do an audiobook. Obviously, it's not a common product for what is an academic monograph. Why did you feel an audiobook was so important for this one?
Yeah. And first off, I want to thank you, Anna, for your willingness to go there. I mean, first of all, there's so many reasons why I absolutely am indebted to you and Multilingual Matters, and I sing y'all's praises constantly, and can't wait to do it again someday. But this being one of them. So one is personal, which is I love audiobooks. I love that I can go anywhere, seemingly, and just sort of be present with a text by way of a reader or potentially the author themselves. I've had such incredible experiences where I'm really engaged in a text, and perhaps on a drive or while traveling, and it actually has inspired me to get a hold of the physical copy and to toggle between the two, to note how I was feeling and what struck me in the audio, and then to bookmark that in the physical. I also listen to a lot of podcasts, as I think many of us might as well. And I just see the modality as being very inviting, and most importantly, highly accessible. So this leads to my second point, which is that I was so concerned, as I think you recall, about cost, affordability. I wanted this to be a book that my students could afford. Not because I wanted my students necessarily to buy my book, but because that is a constant issue. Textbook sales, just text, the prices are just just astronomical. So I was quite concerned about that, and I wanted to meet my students and other readers where they were at in terms of accessibility, both in cost and in format. This is a book that asks a reader to engage. And I also liked the idea that you could listen and pause. I'm asking folks to do that with the physical book as well. There are various pause points in the book, where I'm asking the reader to, in a sense, put the book down and engage with a thinking activity, a writing activity, something that's tactile,
Yeah,
in a sense, reflective. And it made sense to me that the audiobook could ask us to engage in these pauses in a different kind of way. And these conversations are all about other people. It's about sharing ideas. It's about inviting other people in. And I loved the idea potentially of sharing the audiobook or a chapter or a section with a classroom, with a group of teachers. I've done this, my colleagues have done this, where we're reading a text. It has an audio, an audio component. And we're reading this text, And there's something extremely valuable in the physical copy. It's the artwork, it's the layout, it's the ways in which the text itself is asking us to engage. But there's something irreplaceable about it being read to us. And it's not about me reading it to them. It's about the reader, or perhaps, best case scenario, the author. Let's hear their voice, let's hear their cadence, let's hear the urgency in their words, the tone that they take. So I guess part of me too is like I'd really like to engage in this challenge. And I hope that it's worth it. It was an interesting process by which to engage in, much more complex and complicated than I think any of us appreciated.
Yeah.
And but also something that challenged me to engage very intimately with the words on the page. So I went to a studio here in Eugene, Oregon. There's a proper studio, highly professional, with a producer behind glass. It felt very exclusive, and it was a real privilege. I learned sort of tricks of the trade, if you will, bringing hot tea and apple slices to coat the throat. But I had to read page by page my book, word for word, reread. Oh, we didn't catch that. You mumbled, really contending with what I was putting out there. And I mean, that was in and of itself such a such a deep connection with a message. It's like, okay, well, what am I really standing by here? So I hope that that personal element aside, it's an easier way in which folks can get invited into these conversations, quite literally. So yeah.
No, it's I think that's a really interesting point, because we I know obviously we'd spoken over Zoom a lot, so I knew what you sounded like, but none of my colleagues did, and they listened to a bit of the audiobook and they were like, yeah, it's really different to hear it read in his voice rather than our British accents in our head.
Right.
It's that's a really interesting point. So so hopefully it's available most of the places that you might get your audiobook at the moment, and it should be on Audible very shortly. I hate to give Amazon any more publicity than they absolutely have to have, but realistically I think that's where we all get our audiobooks from. So but you can also get it from public libraries as well, I believe. So yeah, okay, I think we can move on to some audience questions now. So Jennifer Schwartz, I'm assuming that's no relation. She says, I love your comment, language makes race happens. How do we conduct ourselves if we don't speak Spanish to others who do? What's our role?
My mom has been asking me this question, I think, for a very long time. I appreciate it. Thanks, Mom. There's a citation in the book that refers to this question, and it's a blog post by my colleague Nelson Flores, that in a sense kind of, okay, look, white people, here's the situation. Not all Latinos, Latinx folks speak Spanish or want to speak Spanish with you, right? And it's like, look, once and for all, let's break this down, right?
Yeah.
And I don't think that he purposed to speak for all Latinx folks in that moment. What he's doing is actually, I think, very carefully elucidating the need to think critically about language and communication, and the differences between production and perception, speaking and listening. And I think it's a reminder that we listen more than we speak, which my mom is a very good listener. And in many ways, she involves listening very intentionally in her work. Um, I think listening is a type of language that we overlook. And as a matter of fact, in the phonetics and pronunciation class that I'm teaching, it's a key part of the class, which is how do we learn to listen better?
Mm-hmm.
Listening isn't something uh, that we value, for instance, in our language education. And so I think that it is resting the assumption that folks that speak Spanish in society, particularly in the United States, either do not speak English or prefer not to. And I think that rests on uh, very convenient stereotypes, damaging stereotypes about Latinx and brown people more generally.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and uh, and so when the weight of that stereotype uh, is looming, um, I can imagine that this prohibits um, a more authentic type of communication for someone who identifies as such.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so I think I think this is about pivoting to listening to how to engage in authentic relationship building,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
as opposed to quickly trying to find the lexical item, the vocabulary, the right thing to say at the right moment to
Mm-hmm.
preserve
Mm-hmm.
the ego.
Yeah.
And that's hard to do. That's really hard to do. I want to be seen as a good person out in society, um, as opposed to just waiting,
Yeah.
um, and and letting a type of encounter, an engagement, a camaraderie unfold naturally, where maybe you're the second one to speak as opposed to the first. We do this all the time, regardless of a perceived language barrier. Um, we're cue followers. So language is also something that is nonverbal. It is something that doesn't necessarily involve spoken words. Um, how do we how might we be invited into conversations as opposed to how do we feel, particularly as white people, that we have to not you know we can't sit in the silences. We have to keep this thing moving forward.
Mm-hmm.
We have to preserve that ego, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's really interesting. And we have another question from Anne Abbott, who I presume isn't your mum. Which says, thank you for this important conversation and your book, Adam. I admire you and your work. How does this deep thinking affect your approach to assessment and grading in your teaching?
That's an interesting question. Well, it depends on the class. It depends on the objectives of a particular course. The first thing that comes to mind, though, is that many of my courses, I take a portfolio approach. A colleague of mine introduced this methodology to me some time ago, and I realized that is very deeply rooted in critical pedagogy.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea is that, okay, let's just take a 10-week course that's offered at the university level, for instance. Any given course for a language course, and perhaps maybe even an upper division course as well. Students are submitting all sorts of work. Written work is likely to be quite common. And I appreciate having the ability to offer feedback to students along the way. And of course, we can rely on certain rubrics that tie to the objectives of a course or a program. But I think my philosophy is to engage in process over product.
Mm.
So, I mean, so much about this book is about transformation, and transformation by way of critical reflection. I really enjoy evaluating students, but asking themselves to evaluate themselves based on a consciousness of their own transformation. What a portfolio allows us to do is to collect these different drafts of a paper, or these different transcriptions of a conversation, or these different ways of looking at ideas, syntheses, and asking a student, okay, these were evaluated in these ways through your peers. I offered feedback. How do you, midterm here, contend with all this? What are you noticing? What are you reflecting on? What are you contending with noticing at the end of the term? Evaluating process over a series of products in which we take averages and call it a day, and also celebrating that evaluation by way of a final showcase, where students can present the growth, the transformation as something to be proud of, and say, hey, look at it in a tangible form. Here's I wrote this autoethnography. Here's an element of my autoethnography with photos and with transcriptions and with that I want to share. I think that's been my approach for a little while now. And the idea is that we leave a learning community with energy, as opposed to energy being taken from us. So that's my assessment approach, and I can turn around and say, okay, well, here were those objectives to the of this class. Maybe it's a class I didn't even author the objectives to, but I can say these proficiencies were were realized in these ways here, and there was transformation, there was growth, there was improvement, so on and so forth. And I have these documents here that we can show you, and these reflections of that growth by the students to really engage in those systems that have been set up for us. It's a way of gently pushing back against a culture that requires quantitative data that is evaluated by someone who is assumed to be expert in the field. Insert the grades, send them along, let's move on to the next class. So it's a way of pushing back on that, and also inviting in community between students and outside guests to the class as well. So,
that's really important. So we have another question from Holly Cashman, and she says, of course, racial identities are at the forefront of this work, but I wonder if you could also comment on how gender and masculinity and heteronormativity interact with race, whiteness in what you say about identities in Spanish language education.
Oh, Holly, that's such a great question. I really appreciate that. Hi. Well, that threads throughout this book as well. It is not the primary title or the name or the focus, I should say, of the book itself, but it's never not separated from the work. And I hope I have made that clear in the book. That to engage in conversations about whiteness, white privilege, if you will, is necessarily to contend with everything that you just named. So I talk about this, for instance, in terms of presence, being in my body in a classroom space, how language is perceived, for instance, as having an accent or not. I mentioned the necessity of listening intentionally and not just speaking, that we read each other like a language, that we read race as well as the ways in which we read gender, in which we read sexuality, in which we interpret these things, because we live in a world in which privilege and power is entangled with all of these identities and normalizes some over others. So I talk about in the book, for instance, this moment when I was making a call to a colleague of mine that I did not know in order to offer a reference for a former student. And this colleague wasn't seeing me, and I wasn't seeing them, but we were simultaneously using each other's language, audio only, to interpret all of the things that you mentioned,
Mm.
and how very slyly it was figuring into the conversation, and the ways in which I knew that my authority wasn't going to be questioned. I knew by virtue of the tone of my voice, my perceived gender, my perceived class status, my perceived education, always encoded in the speech and the ways in which we talk. And Holly, like some of some incredibly important work that you've committed to, the need to disentangle this stuff and say, no, this is not natural. It's been naturalized. And to ask students to engage in these conversations, to ask family members to engage in these conversations about race, to ask colleagues to engage in these conversations about whiteness, is necessarily always to call in all of these other elements of identity that have been, for lack of a better term, twin skin to whiteness. They're the other side of that coin at all times.
Yeah. So this has been brilliant. We've got 2 minutes left, so I think we can fit in one really quick last question from Robert Train, who says, Adam, great book talk. I'm wondering what are, or if there are, limits of conversation, those places that you can't go.
Hey, thanks, Robert. Yeah, always. It depends on the company you're keeping. Who is this person? Who are these people? What is the trust that's been established? In what context have you connected with these individuals? No one's entitled to answers, and no one's entitled necessarily to posing any question that they desire. But this is what's involved with community building. So we're all here, we're in a classroom for 10 weeks, for instance. How can we work with this? And what do I need to earn as a person in a position of power so that I can facilitate a space where you all can empower yourselves? So let's define those limits slowly but surely, and let's see what is needed and what is not needed. I'm not entitled to all the information in the world. Academia and the university does not own all knowledge, nor has it ever. So I guess that's a real short way of addressing that really great question.
Brilliant. Okay, I think that's all we've got time for. Thank you so much, Adam, for your time and for being an absolute pleasure of an author to work with. And thank you also to my colleagues, Eleanor and Flo, who make this all happen behind the scenes. I get to just sit here and chat while they're frantically pressing buttons and hoping the internet doesn't disappear. So thank you to them. Thank you to you all for coming. There will be a discount code. I think, in fact, it's MMCV50, which will get you 50% off Adam's book on our website, or indeed anything else on our website, I think. So if you don't already own it, please take up the opportunity to purchase it with that code, and do download the audiobook as well. And you can take Adam with you on your morning commute.
Best of luck.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Have a good day.
Thank you all.